Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chief Executive, the Travel Foundation, Salli Felton.
Good morning, everybody. I think here in the travel industry, we all recognise the many and varied benefits that tourism provides to destinations. Be it contributions to GDP, be it investment, be it jobs, or the multitude of taxes that comes from tourism, there's no denying that it brings significant contributions to destinations. But benefits don't ever come without costs. And whilst most of us can really describe a lot of the benefits that I've got up here on this slide, can we actually do the same with the costs? I don't think I've ever seen it done. And if we can't articulate the costs of tourism, then how do we know if the balance between these benefits and the costs is actually net positive? That is, how do we know if the benefits that I've listed here are actually paying off for the destinations? We're starting to see really significant recurring patterns emerging in destinations all around the world that suggest that this balance is actually out, be it resident unrest, damage to natural and cultural assets, infrastructure that's failing, and tourist dissatisfaction. These are the issues that we associate with the term over-tourism. But as tourism continues to grow and tourism products continue to diversify, the frequency and scale of these problems is starting to grow as well. And it becomes pretty alarming when you look at the growth forecasts for tourism. You'll all be fairly familiar with this graph because we're currently sitting at 1.4 billion international tourist arrivals, and we hit this figure 2 years before we were forecast to do so. And if we're seeing some of the issues that I was describing associated with over-tourism escalating now, then what do you think, imagine the scale of the problem that we're going to be seeing in 5 to 10 years if we do nothing about it. So if you've been to any of the European tourism hotspots in the last 5 years, or travelled to popular resorts in places like Thailand or Indonesia, you'll have noticed how much they've changed. They're crowded. There's queuing everywhere you look. Most of the souvenirs are from China, and the residents have a certain fatigue. It seems that there is very, very little doubt that tourism is eroding the destinations that we're sending people to, that we love, but that we also rely on as an industry. And in doing so, this is eroding the well-being of millions of people around the world who live in these destinations. Now, surely it's unacceptable for this to be the legacy of tourism. So, understanding this, we at the Travel Foundation teamed up with experts Cornell University and Epler Wood International to actually research this issue in a bit more detail, because we wanted to know not just what was happening, but why it's happening. And as suspected, the research showed that there are, in fact, a number of costs associated with tourism that aren't currently being accounted for. And we called these costs the invisible burden of tourism. Now, possibly not surprisingly, we found that these costs were generally associated with environmental and social impacts. And to give you some examples, if we take the environmental impacts first, and we have a look at resource use, when it comes to electricity and water or generating waste, a tourist consumes or generates 8 to 10 times more than a resident does. And in developing countries, this figure is even higher, in some cases very much higher. Generally, what happens is that countries plan and build for infrastructure, really only taking into account the local population. But in these destinations, we're seeing tourist populations of double, triple, or even 10 times the size of the local population. And who's paying for this infrastructure? You have airports and ports and accommodation providers. They all pay their utilities, they pay their rates, but this doesn't actually cover the cost of expanding capacity, only of maintaining the existing capacity of what's there. And nor does it cover the costs associated with upgrading to greener, more efficient infrastructure that might be required when we're introducing technologies like desalination or waste incineration that might be required in destinations to actually service this tourist population because their resources are scarce. So these costs are usually borne by the municipalities, which effectively means the residents are paying for this tourist cost. And in countries where the municipalities can't afford to do this, the residents end up going without the resources, so they have no water, they have no electricity, or governments obtain development funding to actually cover the cost of upgrading their infrastructure. And all of this contributes to the size of the national debt of these countries, and of this, of course, reduces their chances for poverty alleviation. And this is the opposite of what we promise with tourism. But aside from resource use, tourism also impacts on the natural environment or the natural capital of a destination. Beaches, reef systems, national parks, forests, they're all seeing a significant increase in tourism usage to anything that they've really previously planned for. And as a result, the investment and maintenance requirements for these areas are far exceeding the budgets that they actually have. And when natural capital is not seen as a direct tourism asset or an obvious asset, then it's actually quite often destroyed. So you often see this with the case of coastal mangroves. They're not something a tourist want to see, but they're on the coast, so we develop hotels along coastal strips. And this results in the loss of biodiversity and essential ecosystem services. So these sorts of costs that I'm talking about are global costs, but they far exceed the short-term economic benefits that we're going to be seeing from a few additional hotels. Unfortunately, the invisible burden doesn't stop here. There's also significant social costs. So the growth of the property rental market and ready access or tourism access via online booking platforms is actually resulting in cumulative costs to residents, such as those that I've described on these slides here. There really is very little doubt that tourism is changing and homogenising the social fabric of countries all around the world. And it's clear that tourism is imposing an invisible burden on destinations, and unfortunately they're the ones paying the bill. So where visitor numbers are low, the invisible burden goes largely unnoticed, but as tourism grows, each additional visitor brings an unaccounted additional cost to the destination until a tipping point's reached, and that's the point of over-tourism. But by this point, the damage is already done and the costs have already been incurred. So how did we get here? And why did we fail to see these costs up until now? And I think that in most cases, it's because these costs are actually accounted for outside of the boundaries of tourism. They're accrued by other government agencies, and tourism managers aren't aware of them because they're not looking. And they're not looking because they're using different measures of success. And these measures of success are the total number of visitor arrivals and the gross economic impact of their visitors. And none of these things actually tell us anything about the net benefit of tourism. So effectively, tourism managers are working in the dark. Skipped a slide, sorry about that. And as long as the focus of tourism is limited to this really narrow set of economic measures, we're only going to be getting a one-sided view of the contribution that tourism actually makes to a destination economy. So where do we go from here? Well, if you've been listening to the over-tourism debates, this is certainly not about moving tourists from bucket list destinations to lesser-known destinations. This quite simply isn't going to make the invisible burden costs go away. At its heart, the future of travel really depends on the industry and government's ability to measure and manage the full cost of tourism. And what I'm really talking about when I say this is a fundamental shift or a step change in the way in which we actually do tourism. Now, that can sound scary, I know, but this change can take a number of different forms, and I think that really what we need to be doing is debating and discussing what this looks like. But I wanted to just run through a few things because the future of tourism will require a couple of really key factors if they're going to pick up on these costs. So if we're not currently accounting for costs as I've described, then we need to. And as the costs that I've identified aren't necessarily linked to existing economic metrics, then the only way to measure them is by creating new, more holistic accounting systems. These are systems that will enable managers to understand the population demand versus the actual supply available in destinations. Sounds like a no-brainer, right? But we're not doing it. And these systems are going to need data. So we're going to need to get better at working across both the public and private sector, but also across and between different government agencies to share data and information. And to do that, we're going to require developing new models and ways of working which don't currently exist at the moment. And finally, holistic accounting systems will need access to big data, which will enable them to consider smart destination models, to think about things like full cost recovery. So doing these three things will enable us to measure the balance between tourism's benefits and costs. But it's not just about measuring. We need to do more than this. We need to reshape the way we plan for tourism at the same time, and we need to do this taking a risk-based approach. Destinations have amazing natural and cultural assets and resources, but what's the actual risk of them being undermined by residents, by tourists, or by external factors like climate change? And what might be required to manage and mitigate these risks over time? Because only by knowing these things will we get a more robust platform for long-term master planning and better demand management in destinations. That's the last one there, yeah. So it's easy for me to stand on a stage and say all of this. These are really, really big tasks and they're not currently happening. So if we are going to make them happen and change the way we manage tourism, then there are two really essential things that we need to put in place as a starting point. First up, we're going to need a new breed of tourism manager with enhanced skills, knowledge and resources to move us on from taking a purely marketing approach to a marketing and management approach. And secondly, we have to accept that this idea of changing the way we do tourism is going to cost us money. We can't shy away from that. So we're going to need to devise new financing mechanisms and models such as reallocating taxes, tourism taxes, the development potentially of destination trust funds or international trust funds, tapping into green and social bonds and grant funds. These are all things that I'd love to expand on, but I'm being flashed at with time. I know I'm out of it. So if you want more information, there's a lot more in the report that we've pulled together. And if you'd like to know where you can download that, you can get it free of charge, at a location. I'll tell you, otherwise come and have a chat to me. I'll show you where that is. But even if you don't do that and you only base your thoughts on the conversation and discussion that I've had today, I hope it's provided you with food for thought and convinced you that the time for change is actually now. Because at the end of the day, tourism needs to provide quality over quantity. Our guiding rule as an industry can no longer be more people are better, but rather how good is it the destinations that people visit and what good do they leave behind. So thank you.